legacy. We both have a coffee, and that's really the hope here, is that people feel like they're sitting at the table with us and we're having a conversation about leadership in life. So thank you for carving out the time.
Yeah, totally. Glad to chat.
So I guess I'd love to know more about your journey. What brought you to where you are?
Yeah. So I'm a coach. I work with managers and job seekers. Those are my two kind of focus areas. And I've been doing coaching for about a year. And I started when I sort of slotted in and led my first team, which was around 2017. I didn't really have a lot of support or reinforcement, which is not uncommon when you're a first-time manager. And so I sort of had to figure it out a little bit. And, in that sort of 5-year window, the first 5 years of basically managing and leading teams, I began to kind of understand that, first of all, obviously it's very different from being an individual contributor. Your deliverables are very different as a manager. But the collaborative process and the process of, having a workplace environment that you feel good about and you deliver sort of good work on requires a lot of creating shared power, essentially. And people don't always say that about being a manager, but that's really, that's the entire game in a lot of ways. Because if you're able to create shared power, that's sort of the hedge against, against sort of being a bad boss, to be really blunt about it. So I worked, for many years, I worked in marketing and tech and startups. Then I kind of graduated to leading teams. And then, about a year ago, I started coaching managers and essentially built around that idea, like how do we share power early and often as a hedge against sort of doing the damage that maybe we experienced or saw happen in the workplace. And so that's sort of the thesis in a lot of ways for the work I do.
I love that. And we're going to have much to discuss because a lot of the work that we do centers around power, actually. And actually one of the I guess the primary thinking that we have these days is that most of what is drawing attention from organizations is very symptomatic. So things like burnout, things like a lack of psychological safety, things like stuckness on the team or disconnection or conflict, right? Either artificial harmony where we're not having good conflict or outright, bad boss type conflict. All of that is actually just rooted in power dynamics. It's rooted in leadership that is misaligned. And so we end up talking a lot about misuses of power versus right uses of power, and aligned leadership versus misaligned, or ethical leadership versus unethical. If we're going to be really punchy about it, we pull out the ethical leadership. What actually is that? What does that look like? And for us, that's alignment with values, right? We say this and we do this, and those two things, there's no gap between those. And I think what a lot of employees experience, I've certainly experienced it. My guess is you've had pieces of the journey where you've got that boss, and the reason why they're bad bosses is because they're just really misaligned, right? With either what your needs are for learning and growth and development, or performance, and what they're centering. And so I would love to actually dig into that, your manager journey a little bit, if we can start there. And I'd also love to know if in your coaching practice, but when you stepped into that kind of management role, what's the most important lesson that you learned over the duration of your time in that role?
Well, I think it really does. It centers on what you were just describing, like that gap between words and actions. And, I was actually just thinking about the first startup that I worked in, which was 2013. And I had been working in kind of legacy, corporate environments, doing marketing and PR type work. And then I was in a startup environment, and I got laid off after about a year and a half. And I actually had a great boss. Like, the operations director was a really phenomenal person and just a really good manager. And I don't think I really understood that at the time, but it was just like, this is a really good, functional, collaborative relationship. Super, super good boss. And the startup, had a lot of problems because it's a venture-backed startup. There were 5 co-founders. It was a complex environment, but overall people were actually, pretty good comparative to some of the other environments, that I've been in over the years. But I started, through that experience, when I got laid off, I started sort of noticing the difference between what a company says it is and then what it actually does. And that, for me, was the first starting point for really understanding power in a team environment, the aspirational versus the reality of it. And I'm a very reality-based person. I'm like, what's the product? What's the core? What's the team? What does operation look like? Working in marketing, you learn to create narratives. That's the whole job in a lot of ways. And I'm actually not bad at that. But I really began to understand that you have to make sure that the narrative and the reality fit. And the further that gap is, kind of going back to your question, the further that gap is as a manager between what you say and what you do and what the team says and the team does, what the company says and what the company does, the bigger that gap, the more disconnected people get and the more dangerous it is. Really, I think the bigger that gap is, the higher the risk is that you're taking as a team and as an organization. And so that lesson really, as I began to understand that, I also began to understand as a manager that it was my job to A, reduce that gap, but B, to make sure that gap was visible to everyone, in the organization. And that's not always a pleasant process, but it's an important thing.
I was going to ask, how do you do that? Because I've been in the same space, manager, seeing the incongruencies between intention and impact, or between narrative and reality, and being the person in the boardroom having to point at the values on the wall and being like, hey, help me understand how this decision, that investment, is reflective of those values, because I don't see it, right? And I'm really trying to, make that visible. Is like you said, it's not an easy process, or it can be a bit painful. Lessons, strategies, tools that you've used to make that visible. I love that line of thinking, because that's actually a lot of the work that we do, is just, let's talk about things as they really are and let's make it visible to folks. So thoughts on that, or things that you do to help leaders now in your coaching practice make that visible?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I did when I first started managing, just kind of intuitively, was create what I call like a workflow tools and teams doc. And it wasn't anything fancy. It was just like, how do we agree to work together? That's the workflows. What are the tools that we use? And then who in the team, what are the roles, right? A lot of ways to do that. I mean, you don't have to, there's a whole
there's a library of templates and theories around that.
Yeah, there's like roles-based management. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of things. But if you don't make those things visible or transparent, then you can't negotiate them. And when you can't negotiate them, that's when things get really risky. And so I think, when I think about kind of making it transparent, I think it goes to something that you talk a lot about, especially on this podcast, is if we don't sort of talk about power, who has it, how it's being transferred, how it moves, then that's where the risk comes in, And I also think a little bit about something that Denise Branch, who's an anti-racism educator, talks about. She says, what goes unnamed goes unchanged. That's definitely part of that equation. Mm-hmm. And so, I think the sort of the 2 or 3 tools that I incorporated, as a manager and kind of learned to go back to, were one, having, a flexible living document. And, it doesn't all have to be in some fancy format. It just has to be a place where everyone knows where the agreements are, and how things get done. And then it has to be something you return to and update over time. And then it also has to be in a negotiated process, right? Where people who come in that are newer to the team or have different expertise are able to contribute to and update that. And I think we've all been subject to the mission and vision, you were kind of alluding to it, where we're like, yeah, it's on the wall, it's just nobody's looking at it, and that's very common, right? We don't return to it. We don't actually functionally negotiate and renegotiate the process docs and internal operations. So I do a lot of that. And I think also, really teaching, I think in a good functional team environment, we're teaching each other to listen, and I call it, this isn't like an important phrase or anything, but for me, I call it long lead listening, which is that in a month or two, you should be able to come back, or I should be able to come back to you and say, hey, I was thinking about that thing that we worked on, or that thing that you said, and I wanted to, share another thought or an idea, or just like, I really appreciated that you said that because it gave me some thought over time. So those are the tool sets I think that I really, typically look for and sort of build around in terms of making power visible, because then power becomes negotiated and transparent. And look, it's happening everywhere all the time, right? So why pretend otherwise? Why try to hide it?
That's the interesting phenomenon. So, a little bit of backstory for you and for the listeners probably is that I came to something called the right use of power framework in about 2010 or 11. I was working in addictions treatment at the time, and to be honest, we were struggling because that's a power saturated environment. You've got counselors and youth workers and young people out in a wilderness therapy program, and we were wrestling with power dynamics, but didn't have the language to really name them. And so it was getting really easy. And I noticed this tendency, and I see it in the corporate space as well, or I see it in leadership as well, where we blame those in down power for their responses to the misuses and abuses of power from the people in the up power position. Right. And so you see this quiet quitting, you see this lack of employee engagement, you see all of this noise out there where what we're functionally doing is we're blaming the people without the power to change things for their response to the oppression or the misuses of power coming from above. And this was very evident in addictions treatment because we'd have a young person, get angry in treatment and maybe punch a wall or flip a table and storm out of the room. And we would say things like, oh, they're just not treatment ready. Oh, they don't look like they're motivated for treatment. Let's send them on a timeout. Let's send them home. Let's kick them out of treatment. And we don't step back and say, well, what did we do as employees, as staff with power that contributed to these conditions where this kid felt his only resort was to flip a table, right? And that type of introspection is really only possible, or was more possible for us once we started to see power differently, once we had language for that dynamic that was happening. And so that your piece about making power visible, I think is so important, because so many leaders, that power dynamic is just invisible to them. And they're just blaming people for the responses to the system or to them as leaders. So there's a piece of like power, responsibility, and accountability that only comes after power awareness. And so I love that. And I love that tactical focus that you have on like power actually exists in these structures, in our workflows, in the tools that we choose, in the roles. And that negotiated piece is really important. So that's just me with a long segue question to something, probably. I have that tendency. The listeners are used to me going off on a paragraph or two between questions.
It's good context though, because to your point, if it's not framed, then it doesn't get really dealt with. And the framing is not like we sat down once a year and update our mission and vision. No, that's not a proper use of power. I mean, it's better than nothing, but the proper use of power is like to keep coming back to that and being like, okay, that's power right there. Mm-hmm. Who gets to decide which tool we use for our project management? That's a form of power. We have, among many others. I mean, there's thousands, right? Once you start seeing it, you're like, oh, there's too many.
When you see it, everything is an act of power. When you have it, when you have power in relationship, everything you do and everything you don't do is an act of power, because it has an impact or has the potential to have an impact. I have 3 small kids, and so I'm in a power dynamic, and it's very visible. And choices I make and things I do and don't do, the feedback is pretty immediate, right? And so that was a shift for me, I think, is seeing power in action, seeing power in real time, because oftentimes we get that. I think we all have this, remorse function that kicks in when we don't speak up at the meeting when we wanted to speak up at the meeting, or we said something we didn't want to say to someone, and we get that little bit of guilt in hindsight. Right uses of power are seeing that in real time and addressing it in real time, seeing the power dynamic as it plays out. But that's been a shift, I think, for me and for a lot of the teams we work with, is power isn't this abstract theoretical concept that we can like put on the board and kind of look at. It's actually here. Like, it's in this call right now. You and I are in a power dynamic. And what does that look like? And who has that power, right? And all power, there's no such thing as all power and no power, which is another thing that I'd love to talk. I love this conversation, so we'll keep going with it, and we'll see what bunny trails we go down. But one of the things that I think, especially people in down power roles, and I've been guilty of this in the past, is when I'm in that kind of down power position, I tend to abdicate a little bit, or I throw my hands up in the air and say, like, I don't have the power to change this. It's all like, but that's not really true, right? Like, we always have some sort of power in the context. And so how do you help people? You're working with early managers in your coaching practice. My guess is that they're in middle management hell, which is, they've got needs coming from below, and then they've got demands and expectations coming from above, and they're trying to navigate the power dynamic. what are some of the things that you're seeing that people are most challenged by right now? Maybe that's the question that I want to land on eventually.
It's a difficult place to be. Like you said, middle management the metaphor is hell. I hear it all the time, and I think it's an accurate metaphor in a lot of ways, because I'm sure there's, people have different conceptions of what hell is, but I think one of the main ones is, the idea that you can see how, you're in there, you've got the fires sort of burning and you can't do anything about it, right? That's sort of one of the primary conceptions. And I think middle, being kind of a line manager is one of the hardest parts, because that's the dynamic. And there's, there's a lot of factors that go into that, obviously. I think that, one of the things that comes up a lot is there's what you can control and there's what you can't control, right? And so what you can control obviously gets into sort of our habits around how we respond to things, how we feel about those uses of power that we see, including the injustices that we might see and the frustrations and exclusions and things like that. And then there's sort of like, how do we recognize the spaces and places where we get to make the choices and the decisions? So just as a short example, and I don't believe in sort of pretending that things are fine when they're not. I mean, it's not hard to figure that out about me, but one of the most basic examples that I bring up and talk about with managers is, the way you hold and run space is important. And so I always, if it's 5 minutes to the top of the hour, or it's the top of the hour and I'm starting something, I always set the table, right? I'm like, hey folks, for the next hour, here's what we're going to be doing. Just to clarify what this space is for. And then the other side of the coin at the end of the hour, like, hey guys, hey folks, I'm going to hit pause. I'm going to close it because we've got 5 minutes. People have other things to do. Like, as a manager, that's just the tiniest little example of the kinds of practices that you can exhibit, is just being aware of the space and not letting people be in a place of like deep frustration and feeling disrespected, or not able to be who they are and express themselves or have their feelings. And just being aware of time and space is a very, very important part of the job. So that's just the tiniest little thing, but I think those are the kinds of things when I'm working with folks who feel frustrated, I'm like, be aware of what you have power to do something about. And then when you don't, be honest about that. And I think that may be one of the hardest parts of being a manager, is you don't quite know what to expose to your team or not, especially if you're getting things from upstream where you're like,
right now,
we have a goal that's just ridiculous. It's bananas. We have to somehow, we've got too much work but we've got to make it work somehow, right? Which is very common for me. If you're earlier middle management, you just get a lot of trash that's sort of downstream, right? Figure it out. Good luck. And so you can't always fix that, but you can be honest with your team and transparent. And so you have to find out the way to balance that. Those are the kinds of things that I think come up a lot, is how do you sort of like stay in that place of balance and, but also not be dishonest about those challenges.
Yeah, I love that. And although you say it's a tiny thing, I think it's a really meaningful thing, that ability to facilitate a space and to hold space for people to have meaningful experiences and conversations. I think it's actually an underlooked aspect of leadership. When I sit in on some meetings, when we're doing that ethnographic observation of a team and we're just sitting in and watching meetings, if leaders can't facilitate spaces particularly well, it's evident. It shows up in that frustration, in that stuckness, in that people leaving the meeting being like, well, that was a waste of time. And then they go into the side office and they complain to their colleague about this Tuesday meeting, this stand-up that never gets.
And that's a core skill set. I think that's one of the things, to your point, like, a lot of how I learned to run a meeting is because I was a musician and I ran DIY shows in my garage, basement, art gallery, whatever I was up to. I did that for over a decade. And, you learn a lot about space when you have like a bunch of sweaty people in your living room playing rock and roll, and then you got some, you got a real, there's no other way to put it, you got a real asshole with, who's like being the drunk idiot at the show. That happens. And you got to work that, right? You got to deal with that situation. You learn a lot about space when you're, in a place like that. And, that's just one way to learn it, of course. But, I think people disregard that skill set. Like, so when I see people who train, do training work around that kind of thing, I'm like, no, you should be paying people a lot to really help you learn how to do that, because that's a major, major skill set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. We used to bring in improv trainers for the youth workers and the team, and we used like improv was the mechanism for some of that facilitative skill set, and that, we called it experiential learning, but that like ability to facilitate groups of people through experiences, right? Whether it's a meeting or whether it's a team building or whether it's a group therapy session or whatever it is, right? There's a core, like you said, that core set of skills I think is undervalued and overlooked, especially now that we're more distributed and the power dynamic is less obvious. Like, we're not in the boardroom together and I can't just force a conversation in the same way. So something I really appreciate about you and I'd love to dig into is I go through your LinkedIn feed and I see your name pop up on my LinkedIn feed often. And 99% of the time, you are liking, supporting, commenting on, or sharing the work of other people, right? So this like giver, like you strike me as a giver. In Adam Grant's Givers and Takers, I would put you strongly in the giver category. What drives that for you, or where does that come from? That tendency, is that a thing? Maybe I'm off with my observations, but I really appreciate the level of support you bring to the community, especially to voices that don't traditionally get heard. Mine is a voice that can usually get heard, for lots of reasons, lots of power and privilege that I hold, but I see you actively amplifying and advocating, at least on LinkedIn, in that space. And so, one, I appreciate that about you, and two, what do you think that comes from, or where does that tendency or?
Yeah. I appreciate the compliment. Thank you for that. It is something I spend a fair amount of time at. Like, I don't have a lot of capital, right? I've worked in VC-backed startups where they pour money in. It's like, this pre-seed, seed, series A, B, it's like anywhere from $500,000 to 10, 15, 20, 30 million bucks. I've never been in a place of having a lot of capital. My mom was an immigrant from Israel. My dad's parents were from Italy, like working class family. I just didn't have access to a lot of wealth or capital. But I, from a young age, I've sort of been fortunate to have access to social capital in the sense of like imagination and other resources. And so, I'm sort of relentless in a lot of ways in terms of using that social capital piece and like connecting people and making sure. I mean, this is the biggest, like, if you ask me today, like, what's the one thing you're most afraid of? And I'm not really afraid of a lot of things because I had different life experiences where I just don't, FOMO is not a thing I worry about. But the biggest thing I worry the most about is that people who are doing really important work might not be connected to other people doing important complementary work. And so that, for me, that drives it a lot. Not in an anxious way, but just like, oh, wow, this person's doing really great stuff. I want to make sure that other people who might be able to connect with them and sort of add to that are aware of each other. And that's an art. That's an art to do that. I always sort of try to remind people, like, if you're doing, any kind of community building work, that's an artistic endeavor. Because a lot of times, people don't think about how to use social capital and they don't practice it. And they just sort of go, oh, well, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, the list is long. Like, there's opportunities to connect people across the realm of issues, whether it's, global warming, environmental justice, systemic racism, creating, more positive, thoughtful, inclusive workplaces. I mean, the list is endless. And so it's sort of like, how do you make sure that people are patched in? And, that's an artistic endeavor and it takes a lot of practice. And I think sometimes it looks really easy when you see people who sort of do a lot of it, but it is something that, is cultivated from years and years of sort of practicing and making mistakes too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it seems from the outside, it looks like a natural force, like a natural phenomenon, but I appreciate the fact that it is an artistic endeavor and it takes intention and it takes awareness and it takes willingness. And I've made my share of mistakes in attempting to help or attempting to connect communities. And the line for me, or I guess the piece for me, is being like really understanding my status power and how that shows up in spaces, right? My cisgendered whiteness, my maleness, my English speakingness, my high, like relatively high education, right? Those types of things are in the space with me. It's not just Jeff. People aren't just experiencing Jeff as in my personal power. So in the right use of power framework, we talk about these different types of power, and being the status power is always the trickiest because it's always the thing that you don't really see when you have it, right? I don't see my maleness and how easy it makes it for me to wander around the world and get my needs met in comparison to my spouse or my sister or those types of things. And the same thing goes for all the different statuses, and there's lots of them. And so being mindful of that, and I guess that's an area of growth for me, I would say, is how do I not center myself accidentally and unintentionally, which is just so easy to do.
It is, I mean, like, I'm non-binary but masculine presenting, and I'm the child of Israeli and Italian immigrants, so I'm European American, white, and that comes up for me all the time, where it's like I'm trying to pay attention to how and where that power is sort of adjusted and and used, and being thoughtful about that. And it's easy to overanalyze too on the other side of the coin, where all you do is spend time worrying about what your positionality is. And so I'm very literal, and I think in some ways that's sort of why you see me sort of be in a very almost a relentless place with social capital, is because I see that as distributing social capital and power is sort of, for me, it's a hedge against becoming too self-centered. It's a hedge against sort of not being a force for good in the world, and just sort of ending up kind of like, well, it's really all about me and my needs and values. And so I think when we think about how we use social capital, and there's other capital, knowledge capital, literal capital, wealth, etc., we should be thinking about how to be as creative as possible, and sort of push the boundaries for ourselves around like the different ways and sort of tactics that we can engage in. And I don't talk about it, and I'm not going to talk about it here, but what you might see publicly is only a fraction of what I'm up to. And I don't mean that to be like, I'm great and doing a lot. I'm just saying there's a lot of things you can do, right? And so I try to pay attention to that and be mindful, because I think the opportunities are sort of endless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. And that is its own conversation for sure. And how do we leverage different forms of capital and power? And how do we see, it goes back to that, how do we see power and the different types of it, and how it shows up in our lives and in our systems and in our workplaces. And maybe to bring us back to the workplace, you and I had a bit of a comment thread going earlier this week, or I think it was earlier this week, around toxicity, toxic workplaces, right? And I'd love to get your 2 cents on the toxic workplace, because that's, I generally, whenever I see a buzzword in the ecosystem, I'm like, I don't think that's the thing. I think there's a more nuanced conversation here, but I'd love to hear your perspective on this phenomenon of the toxic workplace.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that and I like that you brought that up too when we were in that thread. I mean, you were kind of, and I responded and was like, yeah, there's a reason I didn't use that word in that particular thread, is because I was thinking about what kind of what you were saying, and having a dialogue. And that's actually a thing that, this is a little more meta, but one of the things that for me helps me understand power and also sort of talk about it with people that I work with, and just sort of keep it present in a functional way, is that I understand that everything's a conversation. And so that kind of in a way comes from, being in marketing and startups for a long time. But there's a constant conversation that's sort of happening. So even when we're not talking about it, it's still sort of bubbling up, right? And sometimes that's like happening in a forum or a group somewhere or a Slack channel. But it may be happening at your coffee shop around the corner, but everything's a conversation. And so, kind of going back to what you're talking about, power is sort of present in all those places. It's happening, it's being exchanged and transferred and negotiated. And so when I look at the way that, the latest buzzword, rage applying, quiet quitting, loud quitting, toxic
Quiet
work.
promoting. I saw quiet promoting the other day. It's like, what the hell?
What is that even? I don't even know what that is. And there's a little bit of like, a kernel of truth in all the things, right? Otherwise, why would they sort of take hold or sort of, but on the other side of the coin, I think, the question that I would always have about, when people sort of use the phrase toxic workplace is like, yes, how? Like, go on, because if, for me, everybody has a different resonance, but for me, when I think of the word toxic, I think of our water supply. And I think of Rachel Carson in Silent Springs, which is sort of a famous, book that came up that kind of made, water quality and other things and air quality more prevalent as a conversation in the 60s and 70s. I think it was in the 60s and 70s, probably 70s. Toxicity means it's in the water, right? It's everywhere. It's built into the system. And, I think it's really important to make a distinction especially when we talk about teams and management and sort of how power functions. It's really important to make a distinction between an environment that has been purposefully polluted, which is what toxicity is, and one that, where you have sort of bad behavior that just needs to be dealt with. And those are two different things. And sometimes we avoid the second thing because we're like, it's a toxic workplace. I'm like, yeah, but has anyone
identified the source?
No one cleaned it up? Or sometimes and let's be real, sometimes workplaces are great, but there's just one real piece of whatever, and if that got dealt with, it would, it's not, there would be no harm or trauma to recover from, but sometimes one person or two people are really driving a lot of it. So there's nuance to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to an early engagement, I'm not a coach, and so the work we do is more around advising, consulting, facilitating type work, but you can't do that without having lots of one-on-one conversations and being pulled into that. And I distinctly remember it's fairly early in my journey, after working in the nonprofit space and addictions treatment, and I got a call from a manager about one of their employees, and they were on the verge of being fired. It was one of those like, get some help with somebody, or like, no, don't work here anymore. And I don't love those scenarios. Like, they're not my favorite place to play with a team, is that, high stakes and people are in an at-risk position. But after about 3 minutes of talking to this fellow, it was a guy, it was an older gentleman, I realized that he had more passion and care and desire for the workplace and the quality of the work environment than anybody else that I had talked to, including his boss. His ability to navigate the tension that he was experiencing between the quality of the workplace and his own internal standards was showing up as toxic behavior. It was showing up as that bullying. It was showing up in ways that not helpful at all and not appropriate, for sure. But when you stripped it back and like, what does he actually care about? He was caring about the decline that he had seen in the quality of services in the organization. So he had more care for the customer, the end user of these services, than anybody else I had talked to. And it was showing up in an incongruent way, right, on the team. And that, to me, shifts us from this conversation about leadership as this individualistic pursuit to what we call leaderfulness or leaderful, which is teams that are working together, that the power has been distributed, that power is transparent. We're talking about the things that need to be talked about, and we recognize that some people have expertise in different areas, and they're gonna lead that. So more of that kind of flatter, sociocracy or holocracy. You can pick an ocracy kind of design, which gets us into organizational design territory pretty quick. In that intersection between kind of individual leadership development and organizational design, I don't think there's enough back and forth there in most workplaces. I think we tend to default to leadership development. Hire Jeff to fix this guy who is yelling at his staff. And it's like, yeah, like maybe, but probably not. Like, there's probably lots more happening here. And so how do you approach that in your coaching practice of bringing the system, being more systems conscious, I guess is what we'd call it, and not just individualistic in your pursuit of helping workplaces evolve or deal with the toxicity, if we're going to use that language?
It's tough, and I think one of the things is just to be aware of that our culture is very oriented towards individualism and consumerism. And I mean, that's sort of like the reality of any toxic environment. is that it can't be solved. We hear people talk about like toxic positivity and hustle culture, where it's like, if you just have a growth mindset, anything is possible. Yeah. And also
Grit.
if your
Grit,
father-in-law,
growth, resiliency.
yeah. And if your father-in-law, works at Goldman Sachs and runs a huge fund, it's just a little bit easier when, all your bills are paid and you're getting introduced to whoever. So I'm very aware of, and I think it's important to acknowledge, individual, for me, at least, like when I'm working with folks on an individual level, I always, always, always acknowledge, like, there may be limits to what you can do in your work environment, and you should be real about that. And if it's a hostile environment for you, then, you should be working to get out of it. And there are different reasons work environments can be hostile for managers. Some of the obvious ones are sexism and racism, because, if you are not heard, you are not valued, but you're pretty good at your job, that's going to cause a lot of scars and trauma, right? And that stuff gets layered on. So I think making sure that, that people see the difference, what you just described, see the difference between the organizational structure and the individual structure, because there are people who have a boss who's a total bully, right? And the question is, why is that person allowed to be a bully in that organization? And that's an organizational question. That's not an individual question, so that interplay is really important. And I think that's where, the visibility piece and transparency are important, because I think a lot of people sort of, like, for example, with, workplaces where there's systemic racism just sort of built in, there's bias and discrimination. It's just part of the operating structure. People are sort of like, oh, and I always laugh when, one of my favorite people for sure on LinkedIn is Madison Butler, who occasionally reminds us, you can fire racists, right? And the best response, I'm not going to say best, but the most ironic response, which happens every time a bunch of people do it, they're like, well, aren't you going to give them a chance? And I'm like, she didn't say a person who did a racist thing once. She said fire racists. So if there's no accountability, everybody in the organization knows that, on all sides of that experience. And we have to make sure that people understand, going back to what you sort of shared a lot about, we have to understand that people understand. We have to make sure people understand the forms of power that exist in that space and place, because there's probably 8 or 9 or 10, right? There's the person who's doing the racist behavior. There's a person who's seeing the racist behavior and saying nothing. There's a person who's experiencing the racist behavior. There's the person who the racist behavior is reported to, but, they're kind of downplaying it or, pretending to fix it, because that happens in a lot of cases. There's the compliance person who's like been made aware, but they're in the legal side of it and they're just thinking about exposure. And I mean, there's, that's just a few of the actors in any given scenario when there's something really harmful happening. And, in that chain, of people, there's opportunities to deal with that situation every time. So when people are like, are you going to be really tough on a racist? I'm like, look, if I exhibit racist behavior in the workplace, and it, and that's not just like you coming to me and saying like, hey, Joe, something you did had a pretty negative impact on this person. Like, we need to change that. Okay, I'm going to have to change that behavior. That's, that rarely happens, right? In a lot of cases, because of all those roles and that signaling, if I am exhibiting some pretty messed up behavior, I already know what I can get away with. That's the reality in a lot of organizations. And that can't be fixed on an individual level. That requires a real leadership and an organizational, approach and accountability, to your point.
Yeah, no, I resonate with that. And I think that's something that we've learned over the past few years is we actually don't do like whack-a-mole with organizations where it's like, oh, we've got a problem over here with Joe and his department, his leadership, go coach him for 6 months and try and change his behavior. It's like, no, that behavior is being fostered or like not being held accountable. Who's not holding Joe accountable? Because they need to be a part of the puzzle, right? and then who's not holding that person accountable? And you end up taking that systems view of things, which I think is lacking in this hyper individualistic, I call it hyper individualism, this Western world that we live in. It's all about me, right? It's all about the individual. So we're trying to disrupt a little bit of that in our practice for sure, in what we say yes and no to. I've got so many questions that I'd love to ask you, but what do you want to talk about? What's top of mind for you? What are you most excited about in your world right now?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about, gosh, I'm going to need to look up the person and I'll share it. I can't remember who it is that says, don't bring your whole self to work, bring your best self to work. That's what we should be optimizing for. And I don't know if it's someone that we know.
Yeah, somewhere.
Jonathan, the name is sort of like right there at the back of my brain. I'll find it and share it with
Sure.
the audience too. But I really like that idea because I think, I think that the sense of like, what is our accountability to each other in a work environment is really important. And I'm sort of been playing with this phrase lately and thinking about the two versions of it. And actually, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on it. And the phrase is, we value what we return to. And it's actually a flip of what we were sort of talking about at the beginning, where it's like, what a lot of people say when it comes to power is, we return to our values. Like we once a year, we look at what's on the wall and, we don't, we return to our values. And the reality is we don't.
Mm-hmm.
But we value what we return to. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. And, I don't go really deep on, I'm not like, I'm a life coach and I'm going to help you reshape your life and your habits. And, there's so much out there about sort of habit formation and things like that and mindsets and stuff. It's not that it doesn't come up in my coaching work. It's just, I prefer to be really practical and I do kind of wrap that around it. But I think really being aware of what we keep sort of coming back to is really, really important, because in any of the things in our work environments, it's sort of the example I always give people is I'm like, oh, you're really into listening and understanding people. So you don't doom scroll your phone, 3 or 4 times an hour, right? And they're like, they give me the look like, oh shit, I got caught. And I know I've done it. I mean, I'm not coming from a place of judgment about it, but we value what we return to.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people feel guilt or shame or stress or anxiety, I always say that. I'm like, well, what are you returning to? Because that is your values. And I think that's, that is maybe the central thing that I've been thinking about for the last few weeks, relative to sort of how do managers, create shared power with their teams, because they see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. And that's very synonymous with a perspective that I gained in addictions treatment, which was addiction makes sense. It has to, right? All behavior makes sense.
Yeah.
It happens for a reason, right? Just because I don't see the meaning in it doesn't mean it's not meaningful for that person. So that doom scrolling is returning to, like, there's a value there. There's a benefit there to that behavior. And I think that, I'm guilty of that too. I'll look at something somebody does and be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And of course it doesn't make sense to me because I don't have the same needs. I don't have the same values, but their behavior is returning them back to that. So I love that. Actually, we value what we return to.
There's a logic to all things. And, it's also like, that's one of the reasons that whenever I like talk with people about coaching or whatnot, I'm just formally or informally, I'm like, look, just make sure you have a lot of resources, because I don't always know or understand the logic inside a given person's head, who among us, right? But I always sort of tell people, I'm like, make sure that you have support and resources, because you need capacity. And if something works, keep it, do more of it. If it doesn't work, let it go. But be aware of what you keep returning to, because, and I think this sort of goes to, the experience you've had working with folks who are going through addiction recovery is, I've had experiences where, I kind of like over relied on alcohol or other things in my life. And it worked in a very short, weird sense, right? But it became a coping mechanism that got unhealthy very quickly, right? And so it's about having a lot of supports and resources. And I think that's sort of half the battle, is just to keep returning to things that help and adding new things that give you perspective
Mhm.
for you.
So it's understanding and being able to, and again, it comes back to visibility probably and accountability. Like there's support, yes, but there's also an accountability mechanism. I think that most of us need in our lives. I know I need an accountability mechanism. I need the buddy who's going to text me and say, "Hey, did you hit the gym today? Like you said you were going to?" And I was like, "Ah, shit, no, I didn't." And
Yeah.
off I go. Right. It's the, um, yeah. So that accountability mechanism, it's that functional until it's dysfunctional. That's probably the thing that, it's functional for me to yell at my staff because it's in the short term, it's going to motivate them to get back to work or perform or do whatever. But in the long term, it's disconnecting us in relationship and it's counterproductive essentially to the culture we want to build or whatever it is. But seeing that short-term functionality and being able to sit with that and say like, hey, there's a need there or there's a value there. There's something there that behavior is reinforcing. Now
Yeah.
what? Like what's an alternative way, or what's the trade-off? Because sometimes that is the trade. Like sometimes with leaders, it's, hey, you're going to do that, but you're going to do it with more consciousness, and you're going to realize the impact it's having on your culture or your people. And I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm just going to help you see the impact of what you're doing. It goes back to that intention impact piece. I rarely meet leaders, and you probably don't either, who say, yeah, I really want to burn people out today. Like my goal, I wake up this morning, I'm like, I want to make life miserable and burn people out. I haven't met that leader. Right. But I have met the leader who's under the gun, under pressure to perform for the board or to, make a certain milestone on revenue or whatever. And that fear of not meeting that translates into some of those behaviors. And so,
Yeah.
again, I think that we're probably aligned in that perspective that, this makes sense. It has to make sense. But is it actually what we want to be doing? Right.
Yeah. It reminds me of like, I've worked in probably a dozen startups that are venture backed over the last decade, in some form or another. And, one of the secret questions that I always sort of ask, at some point is like, oh, so what do you have in place? And it's like, if you're a startup founder, it's a lonely thing, clearly, especially if you're doing the fast venture capital backed mode. You better have other people who are your peers. You better be going to therapy because otherwise you're passing some damage along. You might need a coach. I don't know. It depends on the founder. You better have family and friends. You better be able to do exercise or something that's not work because otherwise, good luck with that. And I've seen enough startup founders to know the difference. And it's sort of like when people don't have that that accountability in that system, like it gets really dangerous really quickly. And it's almost like when that happens, people rise to the level of their biggest danger or risk, because they just don't have that perspective and that support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that advice, and that's echoing Jennifer Velez. Her advice to leaders is go to therapy, right? I think I'd have to echo that, and I'm gonna add a layer. I'm gonna say go to therapy and read bell hooks. I'm rereading some bell hooks work this year, and it's perspective giving and life giving for sure.
I can't remember who it is. Somebody said like, you think Beyonce or anybody that you admire or think does really cool work, you think they have a team. They didn't come up with all that stuff themselves, so you just have to be thinking about your team.
Yeah, totally. Appreciate your time greatly. You've been very generous with it. How can people connect with you and support the work that you're doing? Where should they go? So LinkedIn, obviously, will have a link back to check you out. But is there any place that's action you'd like the audience to take to connect with you or to do something else in the world?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn a lot. Easy to get a hold of via the DMs. I'm also on Mastodon, which is kind of like a replacement for Twitter for me. I enjoy thinking and working with people there. I also have a newsletter, which if you go to theearlymanager.com, you can subscribe to if you want. It sort of goes into lots of these kinds of topics. And every 2 to 3 weeks, I, write something new that sort of thinks about how managers and leaders operate and what the practical day-to-day life is. And, usually there's some templates or tips or resources there. And if that's something that you're looking to do, that's a good place to get some extra help.
Awesome. Well, again, appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Leaderful podcast, and we'll see you on LinkedIn sometime in the near future, I'm sure.
Glad to have had a good conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. Cool. I'll let the recording run because who knows what happens after the fact. There'll be that's down bites, but that's a great length for here. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate connecting actually in person, getting off I like to get off of the commenting and sharing things on LinkedIn into these types of either coffee chat or podcast episode or like something just to put a face to the
it's
name.
more dynamic. The design of the platforms, which is a whole other topic. Platform design is still kind of weak in a lot of ways in terms
It's really weak.
connecting people.
Yeah. But yeah, what do you have on this weekend? Got anything fun planned?
What am I doing? Nothing really crazy. I'm going for a long run on Sunday. I've been actually starting to run a lot more. I used to be a pretty serious like long distance runner, doing ultra marathons and trail runs for a long time. So this week is my first week of just inching above 30 miles a week and running for the first time in a while. So that's kind of on the agenda.
I need to connect you with my buddy Vince. He's an executive coach up here in Canada. He's got a bunch of clients all over the place, but he's an ultra marathoner
Nice.
as well, and just he's a really interesting dude. I think you two would have lots to discuss. His journey has been from the military. He was in the military, and to a very heart-centered executive coach, like somebody who like surprises me all the time with his empathy and his curiosity, because he's a bald, big, military-looking dude. But he's picked up ultra marathons in the last year or two, and he loves them. So,
nice.
At the very least, you guys can compare gear and shoes and all that.
Yeah, it's a little wonky. I know that people are like, "Why would you do that?" But
that's my reaction. It's like, why would you do that?
It's like meditation and other similar things. It's and I think also, I love just not. I hate running on the pavement. I just find that to be super boring. But you put me out in a trail or in a forest, and I'm just like, yes, I could do that for hours. It's just
nice.
Relaxing.
Where are you located? Where are you based out of?
I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Okay.
So, so we have a lot of that here.
Good access to trails.
Yeah. It's nice to be. Yeah. Where are you in Canada? I can't quite remember.
Just outside of Calgary, Alberta.
Okay, cool.
So
just
nice. Probably due north from you.
Yeah. So likewise, lots of good outdoorsy things in that region. I know.
Very, very close to the national parks, to Banff and all those places. So we're blessed for sure.
How old are your kids, Jeff?
They are 11, 8, and 6. So boy, girl, boy. Grade 6, cool. Grade 3, grade 1. It's wild. It's crazy. It's busy, but fun.
Yeah, they'll keep you busy at that age.
Oh man, we just feel like we've turned a corner with the 6-year-old. Little more independent, although he's the third child, and so he's used to getting his needs met by everybody else. And so he's a little bit like, hey, come play with me. Hey, come play with me. So there's lots of that. But yeah, no, they're great kids. They're all doing well. So my oldest son, I was diagnosed with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, about 11 years ago. My wife was pregnant actually with our first kid, and then he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 9. 2 years ago, kind of early days of the pandemic. So that's been a thing that we, that extra layer of managing life on top of that. But other than that, they're all happy and healthy. So
good. Yeah, it's a good thing.
Yeah. But I'll let you go. You've been gracious with your time. I like to be prompt. That's leader, manager, facilitator. Like, we're at the top of the hour. Give you your 5 minutes back. You can go take a deep breath before your next thing. So appreciate you, Joe, and appreciate this. And I'll let you know. It'll probably be a week or 2 or 3. I don't know exactly when we'll queue this up into the schedule, but we're usually pretty quick at the turnaround. But I'll give you a heads up and I'll fire it your way. And I'll slice it down into something coherent, which I'm sure it will be. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, glad to get a chance to chat, and let's stay patched in.
So. Yeah, likewise. Cheers.
Okay, awesome. Bye. Have a great weekend.
You too.